Shabbos, everyone. So nice to see you all. Mazel tov. There's an old Jewish joke about two women who were in a bitter feud for years. So Yom Kippur rolls around, and one goes up to the other and says, "Listen, it's enough already. Let's put an end to our feud and give each other wishes for the new year." And the second one said, "I agree. And so in the coming year, I wish for you all the things you wish for me." The first one says, "You're starting up again." See, vengeance runs very deep in us, and it's hard to let go. And this joke is really about the idea that we're not supposed to hold on to those kinds of things. You're supposed to let them go. But again, it's hard. As it's been said, nobody forgets where they buried the hatchet. In other words, you may put away the grievance, but you remember where it is, and when you need to dig it up, you will. And that feeling, that desire to take vengeance, is something we both universally feel and universally condemn. And then we come to what is in some ways the most beautiful part of the Passover Seder, where someone, often a child, gets up and opens the door for Elijah. We just read about it. And what do we do when we open the door for Elijah? Do we say, "Welcome, O heralder of the Messiah, we bring you tidings of goodness and peace"? Is that what we say? This is what we say. Here's a standard Haggadah. We say, "Shvoch hamatcha el hagoyim asher lo yidaucha ve'al mamlachot asher b'shimcha lo yikaru." That's the first verse. There's 3 verses, 2 from Psalms, 1 from Lamentations. This is what it says in English. "Pour out your wrath on the nations that do not know you, and the countries that do not call out in your name, for they have devoured Jacob and destroyed his home. Pour out your wrath on them. Let your burning anger overtake them. Pursue them with anger and blot them out from under the heavens." And I understand that some people may not like that. Some might think it's a little inappropriate or ungenerous to open the door to redemption and basically scream about how God should destroy all those people that have treated us badly. In fact, I know people who deliberately skip that passage. I even have a Haggadah, among the too many that I've collected, that changes the wording to say, "Shvoch ahavatcha," pour out your love, which is very nice, but it's not what the Haggadah actually says. I also want to point out, by the way, that this passage did not start at the time of the rabbis, did not start at the time of the Bible. This passage was included in the Haggadah in the Middle Ages, around the 10th and 11th centuries. We don't see it mentioned by anyone before that. So it's not as though Jews have always opened the door and recited, "Pour out your wrath." The opening of the door started a little earlier, but "Pour out your wrath" started in the Middle Ages. And we, here in America, have for the past several decades live largely in goodwill with our neighbors. So you might feel uncomfortable opening the door and screaming out to Tiburon, "Go pour out your wrath on all those who live off Tiburon Boulevard, who know you not." Seems kind of ridiculous. And yet I like this part of the Seder. I say it, and I'll give you 2 reasons to suggest that you feel more comfortable about saying it if you don't say it or you don't like it. The first reason that we should read about vengeance on God's enemies is precisely because we live in a place and time where we are, by and large, still okay. For a long time, though, Jews were not okay, and they suffered. And you can imagine what people endured who put this in the Haggadah. If it wasn't there in the rabbinic period, and it wasn't there until the Middle Ages, what motivated someone to put it in there to the point that it got universal acceptance and every Haggadah in the world has this? Can you imagine the suffering? Can you imagine the parents whose children were taken, the children whose parents were tortured and murdered before their eyes, the women who were treated unspeakably? This was put in during the Crusades, when as Christian Europe marched toward Jerusalem, what they did along the way was decimate Jewish communities, slaughtering scholars, families, teachers, women, children, horrible things. And the Jews, who took no earthly revenge because they had no power, took spiritual revenge, and they asked God to help them. I guess I just feel, as somebody who's grown up so fortunate, that I owe a genuine spiritual debt to express on behalf of those who are no longer here. The anger, the fury, the suffering that they felt. I feel like if I stop expressing it because my life is okay and fine, I'm negating the enormous injustices that my ancestors endured so that the Jewish people could survive, and I and we could get to the point where we could have a Seder in Marin County, California, in comfort and without fear. I personally don't think I have the right to edit their anger, but rather I should express it for them. I feel like my ancestors would look down upon me with sadness, asking, really, how could you forget what happened to us? Second, all you have to do is look at the news to know that we live in a world, and despite our relative comfort for the past few decades, we've always lived in a world where, if given the chance, there are people who would do the same thing to us as what our ancestors experienced. They would, all over this world. We see them in broad daylight. There are people all over this world who would recreate the same situation that led our ancestors to apply these verses to our Haggadah. And there are places in the world where you may not actually want to open your door on Passover. In fact, one of the reasons scholars give as to why the custom of opening the door became so prevalent is because we wanted the non-Jewish world to see that there was nothing afoul going on in the home. Because throughout medieval Europe, it was said Jews baked the blood of Christian children into their matzah. But that same blood libel, which you would think would disappear in any rational world, has reappeared. And there are people today who believe in the same absurdly vicious lie, and others like it. In fact, we're living amidst a current blood libel that has simply become normalized throughout the world, that speaks to a form of either conscious or unconscious anti-Semitism that we experience in the media. You hear all the time that Israel, and by extension Jews, particularly those who support Israel, is committing a genocide against Palestinians. In addition to genocide, you will hear phrases like indiscriminate bombing and intentional targeting of women, children, and aid workers. Even the language around the recent exchange with Iran, when Israel targeted Iranian generals working out of an Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters in Damascus, not an embassy, who were there directing Hezbollah missiles against the northern Israel, the media says Israel started the provocation, or calling what has been a regional war for decades a tit for tat. Yeah, 350 cruise missiles fired toward Tel Aviv and across Israel is a tit for tat. But I digress. Still, American politicians have outright used the term genocide and indiscriminate bombing and deliberate targeting of innocents, and many, if not outright, when asked, won't deny it. And part of the reason for that is because of the numbers that are reported. You constantly hear about this number of 32,000 or sometimes 33,000 Palestinians killed in the Gaza war. And this may surprise you, but that number is simply incorrect. It's misleading at best and patently false at worst. And you don't have to be a statistician to understand this. Although some statisticians have pointed this out, including Abraham Weiner from the University of Pennsylvania, who published an article about it in last month's Tablet, how the Gaza Health Ministry fakes casualty numbers. And he focuses on the obvious oddities in the numbers of women and children casualties. Now, certainly, we can criticize Israeli policies. You are welcome to. I do. I disagree with many. And you can certainly criticize Israeli politicians, a couple of whom rant radical and obscene things. Criticizing Israel is, by the way, not anti-Zionism. It's just criticizing Israel. Anti-Zionism is something altogether different, something slippery, that's hard to comprehend exactly. And from what I can tell, it's by and large pretty much a front for anti-Semitism. But you don't even have to go there. I'm just talking about numbers. First of all, the number 32 or 33,000 comes directly from Hamas itself. And we know Hamas's statistics are untrustworthy and part of their propaganda. Second, it doesn't account for the approximately 14,000 Palestinian terrorists and Hamas fighters who've been killed. Third, it doesn't take into account the Palestinians who were killed by what is estimated as 30% of the Palestinian rockets that fell short into Gaza, killing their own, like the one that hit that hospital, which we later learned was actually a parking lot, early in the war last October. And it doesn't take into account the estimated 4,000 plus Palestinians who would have died since October 7th by natural causes. So if a Palestinian had cancer prior to October 7th or heart disease or which is very old and happened to have died naturally after October 7th, that's included in Hamas's numbers, and that too is branded as Israel's fault. Yes, innocent civilians have been killed. Yes, targets have been tragically mistaken. Yes, people are killed in friendly fire, including Israelis by Israelis, and it's unmistakably awful and horrendous. And it has happened throughout history by nearly every country in the world, and we have a word for it in the English language. It's called war. And war is horrifying and devastating and disgusting, and sane people try to avoid it as much as possible. But just breaking down the numbers, you can see that the label of genocide and passive acceptance of Hamas's numbers is either a conscious or unconscious attempt to libel us and Israel as war criminals. So when we say, Shvo Hamatcha, yes, it's an historical memory, but it certainly has a contemporary application. And the other part of this that's important to note is that nobody runs out of their Seder with a sword or a gun. Nobody say, now we're going to slaughter all those people that don't like us. Instead, we ask God to pour out God's wrath, because presumably God will know how to do it right. We cannot control our anger, but God can. So we speak these words as a way of asking God to carry our anger for us. There's no prayer here to give us a great army to wipe out our enemies. There's a prayer here that God will do it. And still, even in the words themselves, you can find the other side of it. The Kotzker Rebbe taught that when we say Shvo Hamatcha, inside the word Hamatcha, which means anger or wrath, is another Hebrew word, which is Chom, meaning warmth. So said the Kotzker that you might also be asking God to pour out God's warmth on those people and melt their hearts. But what these verses ultimately show is that anger is an indispensable part of human character. And the question that everyone has to deal with is not how to extinguish anger, but how to manage it. There's not one person that doesn't get angry, but the key is learning how to channel it in a way that it can at least be non-destructive or maybe even constructive. One of the ways we do it in the Jewish tradition is to ritualize it. I never hurt anyone when I opened the door and said Shvo Hamatcha, but I was able to express my anger and the anger of all those who came before me. Finally, I want to say that the Passover Seder tells a long story. Included in it is the sadness and death of our enemies, when we remove the drops of wine from our cups because the Egyptians died. Surely, in this central celebration, we can spare a minute to express the pain and anger and anguish, which is a part of who we are, because of what they did and are doing. So on Monday night, when you open the door, I want you to not feel badly for saying those words, because it does exactly what a ritual is supposed to do, which is take everything inside you and not pretend we're only angels composed of sweetness and light, but take everything inside us and use it as a way that contributes to the beauty and truth and coherence and life that embodies our tradition. And remember, we don't end with Shvo Hamatcha. We end with songs for children and a wish that next year we will be in Jerusalem. Shvo Hamatcha is not the last word. The last word is a prayer that next year, if we open the door and Elijah walks in, we will never have to say those words again. Shabbat Shalom.